What has our real history been? And really, what is the truth? What is the truth of our consciousness? And what is the truth of our story? We've had thousands of years where there's been this systematic attempt to not only destroy and suppress certain aspects of history, but also suppress us. And so I'm going to bring together some information tonight that's going to group together, following these clues of the past, that can piece together this ancient struggle that's been going on between kind of these two sides of us, either of those who want us to reach a higher state of consciousness, those who want us to stay in a lower state and be controlled through war and all these things that can happen in our timeline and our planet. There's been these two sides that have either kind of been trying to hide the truth because they're ashamed of what's kind of happened in history, and then there's been another side that's been trying to expose it. When I was looking all over the world at statues of plumed serpents and dragons and all of these things that were connecting back, at first people would see those and say, well, those creatures never existed and all those various things, and then they don't realize that they're actually creating a statue that's really kind of a symbol and a metaphor for way into the future when we can actually understand it. So they were brilliant in these advanced cultures in the fact that they could show a symbol that could represent the entire heart of how they represent themselves. I want to show evidence that proves that there's been this kind of hidden struggle between the gods over using civilizations to kind of do their bidding in terms of how timelines will go. And so I call this struggle the battle of the eagle and the serpent because it became very apparent when we were doing research, people that look at this all across the world, there was this struggle where there were these two sides representing using symbology of either the serpent and the dragon versus this eagle. And there were two sides that were constantly competed, and those civilizations that bore the eagle both on flags and crests and on things like golden, statues and various things. And then those who had the serpent and the dragon, there was this clash between the two different sides during how that civilization was gonna be run and what the outcome was. And so when I was going through all of these things, as much as the truth in ancient history locations has been lost in some cases, these flags and crests that we still have today has actually been maintained. And I see that as maybe kind of an ego thing, kind of being proud. And so you can look at flags and crests right now for countries all over the world and then see their mentality, and it starts to make a lot of sense who they've been run by. And to explain how that happened, we have to go back, all the way back to ancient Egypt and Sumer, to understand this story, because that's where it all began. That's our earliest records for our most advanced civilization. We have, if we go back to this earliest Sumerian culture and we look at their writings, known as cuneiform tablets, and we should understand what cuneiform tablets are because they're very important towards our story. So we have to get past the idea that this is a myth and it's just some mistranslation, because these cuneiform tablets, such as the Enuma Elish or the Atrahasis or the Sumerian Kings List, they represent the most unbiased and unpolluted aspects of understanding who we really are, because there are the records that go back as far as we can before this rewriting and tampering occurred, and you can see where that occurred in history based on where this struggle of these the two sides of these gods, who won in certain areas and who lost. And so in these writings we learned that there's been this struggle for well over 100,000 years here, kind of using all these propped up civilizations, and then they rise and they fall based on who controls them. And it's based on these two Sumerian brothers. And this is very important for people to understand, is these gods. And this first one was known as Enki, known to the Greeks as Poseidon, which of course everybody knows. And his brother was known as Enlil, and he was known to the Greeks as Zeus. And these two brothers have been basically the puppeteers behind our time. These ancient gods, they would be named things based on what their status or territory was. So to break these names down so people understand, En simply meant Lord. So Enki, Enlil, you have Enki, Lord of the earth. Ki was earth. And you have Enlil, which is Lord of basically the sky and the air. And so they had these names that were basically fitting towards their titles. So these two brothers that are competing against how civilizations go, they have symbols that represent themselves. That's how these gods work. So Enki had the symbol of the serpent and the dragon. That's Poseidon. And Zeus had the symbol of the eagle. That's Enlil. And so these two brothers with these two symbols, that's why I called it the battle of the serpent and the eagle, because it's about this struggle between the two and how civilizations will go. And so what are those characteristics? Well, any civilization that was built off of the morals of this dragon serpent wisdom was always based on higher consciousness and based on connecting back to the stars, whereas those who were based on the eagle were always based on this warring mentality. If we look at that kind of inverted truth of how the serpent has been made to believe that it's this evil figure to kind of mislead us all along, you can go back all the way to places like the Garden of Eden story on how the serpent was the one who tempted Adam and Eve, which, by the way, their original names in these cuneiform writings was actually Adamu. We've been kind of misdirected with their names to make it seem like things are fairy tales when they're actually historical events. So it's mentioned, that the serpent, tempts Adam and Eve, Adamu, with higher consciousness. But we're told in the modern Bible and things now that's Satan and that's the devil and that's evil, and that God is the one that's protecting us. Whereas it's just these two brothers playing these two different roles. So they're referencing Enki as being the snake, and that's why they're saying he is evil and the devil. And it's very interesting to mention that Enki, Poseidon, had a three-pronged trident, and the inverted view of that is to pretend he's Satan with the pitchfork. So it's these very clever ways that they've inverted what the truth is, so we don't actually realize that we're kind of worshiping the eagle, and we have hatred towards kind of the opposite of what we should. And I want to bring some really kind of astounding evidence to go along with that to kind of prove it. And if you look at flags and crests, you can see the truth to that all throughout history. It's been maintained. Look at and the truth of the past is you can find out by just looking at the actions of what happened. Look at the Romans, controlled by the eagle. All their mentality was simply conquering cultures all over, civilizations all over, Europe and Turkey and all those areas. And then you go to the Nazis, the same exact mentality, that same eagle. It's present every single time. And remember, that same mentality is reflected upon the God's values. So Enlil's value of war and those sons that go below him, that's reflected in those civilizations. Now, the one that's going to be the most difficult for people, the one that people are going to have to be objective and step back and see themselves from an outside view, is looking at the country that maybe most of the people are listening to this in, and that's the United States. And of course, the United States has an eagle, and we have been at war for over 225 years, connecting right back to this kind of eagle side of these elites that have basically were able to then control and take over a place like the United States. That's why the eagle was then implemented. So when you see an eagle then implemented, it's almost like when you see a warring army then put down a flag and say, like, we've claimed this territory. And so the founding fathers didn't want an eagle to represent them. They actually wanted a turkey. Following all these warring culture empires, we look back in history. We look back at what we're taught in school about these heroes, these conquistadors from the Spanish Empire run by the eagle. We have to understand this systematic kind of control from the north to south of the United States from these powers of the eagle. We can follow this back to every conquering empire of the world if we just simply look at their flag. And by looking at those flags, we can see this distinction in places like the Russian coat of arms, the old flags of these empires, and they actually show on some of these flags, they show like a knight actually slaying and killing a serpent dragon. So there's been this ancient struggle, as I said, that goes as far back as we can imagine in our records, where they've been trying to control civilizations based on these morals. Now let's keep going, because Enlil had sons and Enki had sons, and those sons would basically reflect the values of their family. Enlil had a son named Ninurta, And Ninurta was the one actually represented through this Byzantine eagle, which is the double-headed eagle. And you can find and connect that all the way back to the Byzantine Empire when the Roman Empire collapsed and kind of morphed into controlling religion. That was where it first occurred. And we can just essentially trace these events in history for when the eagle took over different aspects of, you could call it reality, right? Because the ancient serpent and dragon wisdom, it connected back to what was known as the old religion. It represented what we think of as the Druid knowledge, and the knowledge that connected to places like Stonehenge and the stars. And so any culture we see, like the Southwest United States, Chaco Canyon, all these places that represent stone structures that are aligned to star constellations, and all of these places, they always come back to represent this serpent dragon knowledge, because that's what their morals were. That's what they based themselves on. So these civilizations were propped up based on those values, and they would later be corrupted based on those who were jealous. So this god Ninurta, who is one of Enlil's sons, he was known as the god of war. And you can just look into that and see that. And he was the one who was in control of the Roman empires and a lot of these past empires. And so if we look at just a couple important things to understand, in around 313 AD, the Roman Empire was collapsing, and Constantine I reorganized this Roman Byzantine Empire under the eagle to, instead of just being a conquering empire based on the acquisition of resources, they ended up realizing that religion and using that as a controlling mechanism of the mind was a lot more effective. As these empires are collapsing, because they're unsustainable, of course, and I want people to remember that, all conquering empires are unsustainable. When this empire was collapsing, they realized they had to do something fast. So Constantine took these ancient writings, like the Book of Enoch, the Book of John, the Nag Hammadi scriptures, any of these ancient writings that go back to this knowledge of the snake. And by the way, Nag, for Nag Hammadi, Nag simply means snake. All of these ancient writings, and they essentially rewrote them to then change them around to embrace a mentality that was of control. And today we can still see in these more pure religions that haven't been quite as controlled, like Hinduism and Buddhism and a lot of places where they still worship the snake. It's still there. It's still present. Anywhere on the planet you still see that dragon snake on their flag, like places like China and Japan. You still see these remnants of this mature, conscious culture that has kind of long been destroyed. Let's bring this right back into kind of understanding even things we celebrate. So think about this ancient wisdom, this old religion that's echoed all over the world in these ancient cultures by the serpent and dragon versus the eagle, and we look at when religion was controlled and taken over by these warring powers. Look at a famous holiday like St. Patrick's Day. You know, people in the United States love to celebrate St. Patrick's Day. They get drunk, they have a good time, they think about leprechauns, but they don't realize what the actual holiday is representing. In the 17th century, St. Patrick, the whole idea behind that holiday is that he was ridding the snakes from Ireland. Now, if you look at the latitude of Ireland and you look at its geographic history, you'll know that there's never been any snakes there. Snakes have never lived there during when humans lived there. So then what are snakes? They're just metaphors. That's what we've been stumbling over for so long to not understand, both connecting back to the gods and what they're trying to show through all these different events, is that they use metaphors to really describe what the real truth is. And if you look into who the snakes were in Ireland, you simply see that they were druids. Last place of this snake knowledge. That's why they called them the snakes. And they were ridding them because, as I said, religion had been controlled by the eagle at that point. And they were now systematically trying to rid the world of this serpent knowledge. And of course the druids are the very same ones who connect back to Stonehenge and these old religions. And now this is where it gets really interesting. If you go to these civilizations like the Maya and the Aztec and the Inca, this is where the serpent and dragon knowledge is the best represented in the whole world. And you can still see that today. And so basically what that battle shows is that these Mayan, Aztec, and Inca cultures all had statues all over their cultures in every location that they had of these serpents, plumed serpents, and snakes. Just, it's everywhere. And dragons. It's all over those cultures. And you start to wonder why they would all have those, and what the kind of the real story behind these gods, right? The Aztec culture god was known as Quetzalcoatl, and the Mayans called their god Kukulkan. And if you go down to the Inca, they called their god Amaru or Amaruca. And so think about that for a minute. The name Amaruca is that's where it starts to get very interesting when you start looking at history, like America. And the Americas, what we consider the Americas, and we learned that it's based after someone that named it. But where really, if we look at these ancient gods and they called this the land of the serpent, which was Amaruca, you can see where the name America came from. And that's what's so special about this whole thing, was that these civilizations of the Americas were all linked and they were all connected, and that's why they all represented this ancient serpent knowledge, because these brothers were battling to both create civilizations and then corrupt and destroy them. I want to point out that I got to see this firsthand. I just got a chance to visit Chichen Itza, which is part of the Mayans. And when I was down there, I had all this, ready, looking for, can I find evidence of this, right? Is there things that people haven't found yet because it's been so suppressed? And when I was down there in Chichen Itza, near Kukulkan's temple, there was this area that my wife and I just we stumbled upon these inscriptions on the walls in an area that was kind of off to the side where people aren't paying attention. And I took pictures and brought them back and shared them, because on those inscriptions it showed this Kukulkan god of the serpent with snakes all around them and all these things, and then next to him showed an eagle. And it was inside the eagle's mouth was a pine cone, which if you look at ancient history, the pine cone has always been represented as the seat of knowledge and higher consciousness. So this eagle was eating this pine cone, like it was controlling it, dominating over the serpent god next to him. And look at that it's telling a story. It's telling a story of what happened and how, and then if you go in and you look at what happened to those cultures, you can see that they were once connected to this pure knowledge of the stars and understand the constellations, just like the Druids.
There's a lot of history that we simply just don't even understand, of these gods that came before us and these royal bloodlines that then trailed down to the kings and pharaohs of history. And we perceive them as just being these men that ruled over slaves, but it was much more than that. It was about these bloodlines that have come from the stars.